That's the part of Zaya Wade's story that doesn't usually make it into a 30-second clip. Right now, for the first time, she's living away from her father, Dewayne Wade, and her stepmother, Gabrielle Union. She settled into her first year of college, figuring out who she is without her parents down the hall, balancing classes, modeling shoots, and the advocacy work she's built into a real organization, all without the built-in support system she grew up with. In this video, we're going through her full story, how she came out to her parents, and what that process actually looked like, how Dewayne Wade responded, both behind the scenes and in public, and what he said about it over the years, what fans and critics had to say once her story became national news, the translatable project which she launched through the Wade Family Foundation and has grown into a real resource for other LGBTQIA+ youth. And finally, what it's actually meant for her to be away from her parents for the first time. Stick around until the end, because the way she's talked about missing home this year says more about what this whole journey has cost her than any single headline ever could. For the sake of this video, we go on this, bro, or she, so let's get into it. Before getting into the heavier parts of this, here's some quick context. Zaya Wade is the daughter of retired NBA superstar Dewayne Wade and his first wife, Siobhan Funches. Born in 2007, she's now officially 19, stepping into full adulthood after spending more than half her life in front of cameras simply because of who her father is. Her stepmother is actress Gabrielle Union, who married Dewayne in 2014 and has been raising her alongside him for over a decade now. For most of her early childhood, Zaya was just along for the ride, showing up at games, appearing in family photos, living the version of childhood that comes with a famous last name. That changed in 2020, when the family confirmed publicly that Zaya is transgender. From that point forward, she became one of the most visible young trans women in the country. Not because she set out to be a spokesperson for anyone, but because her life simply happened to unfold in front of an audience that was already watching her father's career. What gets lost sometimes is that this wasn't a sudden shift for her internally. Dewayne Wade has said Zaya had a sense of who she was as early as age 3. Everything the public eventually saw, the interviews, the red carpets, the magazine features, was really just the visible surface of a much longer, much quieter process that happened mostly at home, the same way it does in any family working through something like this. Let's walk through the actual timeline, because it matters. Dewayne Wade has said that around age 8, Zaya told her family she was gay. The family chose to keep that private, not out of embarrassment, but out of protection. Wade has talked openly about how harsh public scrutiny can be, and he said directly that his child wasn't ready for what the world might say about her at that age. That instinct is one most parents would understand, famous or not. There's a difference between a kid figuring something out privately and that same kid having strangers weigh in on it before they'd even had time to process it themselves. Over the next several years, Zaya's understanding of herself kept developing. By age 12, she'd done her own research and come back to her family with something more specific. According to Wade, she sat the whole family down and explained methodically that she didn't think gay was the right word for her. She went through it step by step, her identity, her pronouns, the name she wanted to go by. It wasn't one dramatic confession moment the way movies tend to frame these things. By her father's account, it played out more like Zaya presenting a conclusion she'd already worked through entirely on her own, and asking her family to catch up to where she already was. That detail tends to stick with people once they hear it, because we're conditioned to think about these moments through the parents' reaction first. Here, a lot of the actual emotional groundwork had already been done by kids still in middle school. Wade has described the family's role from that point as sitting down together and genuinely trying to understand who Zaya was and what she needed, instead of assuming they already knew. Even after that conversation at home, the family didn't rush to make it public. The world found out in February 2020 when Wade appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show and described himself and Gabrielle Union as proud parents of a child in the LGBTQIA+ community. Weeks later, Zaya made her first public appearance under her new name and identity at the Truth Awards in Los Angeles, an event honoring achievements within the Black LGBTQ+ community. She walked the carpet with her dad and Gabrielle Union, the three of them in matching custom suits. Dewayne posted about the night afterward, formally introducing her to the public as Zaya Wade and saying how proud the family was of the way she handled the questions that came her way. Here's where the story gets a little more layered, because Dewayne Wade's reaction wasn't one clean moment. It's been an ongoing thing he's discussed piece by piece, across interviews, a memoir, and red carpets. And when you put it all together, the picture is more thoughtful than you might expect from someone who's openly admitted he didn't walk into this with much personal experience to draw on. One of his most repeated lines came during a 2020 appearance on Good Morning America, where Robin Roberts asked if he'd known early on about Zaya's identity. His answer was short, but it's the line people still bring up. He said he knew early on that he had to check himself. That's a fairly honest admission from someone who grew up in a traditional household in Chicago and came up through post-sports locker rooms, environments that weren't exactly built around these conversations. Instead of pretending to have it figured out, he's framed his role over and over as a student in the situation, saying that if something comes up involving his kids that he doesn't understand, it's on him to go learn it rather than guess. That attitude showed up in concrete ways. Wade and Union have talked about reaching out to the cast of the show Pose, which centers trans characters, specifically to get educated by people who could speak to an experience neither of them had personally lived. In later interviews, Wade has described staying in close contact with Zaya even while traveling, sending her clips of interviews where he talks about her so she can confirm he's representing her accurately. He said he tells her to correct them whenever he gets something wrong, and that she has. He's also pushed back at times against the idea that Zaya should be reduced entirely to her gender identity in public conversation. In an interview tied to his memoir, he made a point of saying Zaya is more than his transgender daughter. She's a kid who's kept strong grades, who's trying to fit in like any other teenager, who has a personality and interests well beyond the headline most outlets reach for. He's called her, more than once, one of the most influential teachers of his own life, which is a notable thing for a Hall of Fame athlete to say about a kid who was barely a teenager at the time. Where that public advocacy got tested in a much harder, more uncomfortable way was in 2022, where Siobhan Funches, Zaya's biological mother, filed a legal objection to a petition Wade had submitted to formally change Zaya's name and gender marker. Funches argued in court filings that Wade hadn't properly consulted her, as required under their custody agreement, and raised concerns that he might be financially benefiting from Zaya's public transition through endorsements and media appearances. She asked the court to delay any legal changes until Zaya turned 18. Wade responded publicly on Instagram, calling the allegations damaging and pointing out that the filing became public news while Zaya was sitting in a classroom. A kid who, according to him, had maintained a 4.0 GPA while dealing with constant outside debate about her own identity.
Which way do you mean? Am I able to visit my children in theory or in fact? On paper or in reality? Because those are two different questions. The document says I'm entitled to visit with my children. But when I got all the way to Florida, Mr. Wade let me know he was going to have Zaire.
He pushed back firmly on the suggestion that Zaya was being pressured into anything, writing that no one in their household would ever force an identity onto a child against her will. He referenced an earlier custody dispute with Funches as well, noting he'd previously been awarded sole custody of Zaya and her older brother. The court ultimately ruled in Wade's favor. In 2023, a Los Angeles judge approved a legal name and gender change, officially recognizing her as Zaya Malachi Arenas Wade. That whole stretch is a reminder that even with the famous vocally supportive father, Zaya's path hasn't been free of conflict, including conflict inside her own family. It's a messier, more complicated picture than the highlight reel version of supportive dad backs daughter publicly, and it belongs in this story because it's part of what shaped the years leading up to where she's at now. Public reaction to all of this has never been one-sided, and that's worth being honest about. On one end, there's been a real wave of support. Zaya has been recognized repeatedly by LGBTQ plus media and entertainment outlets. She's been featured on LGBTQ entertainment brand Logo's annual list profiling notable young entertainers and advocates, and she picked up a groundbreaker honor at the Out 100 Gala, an event recognizing influential LGBTQ plus figures across entertainment and culture. Those kinds of recognitions don't typically go to teenagers, which says something about how quickly she went from famous athlete's kid to being treated as an advocate in her own right, separate from her father's name. Plenty of fans, including people well outside the LGBTQ plus community specifically, have pointed to Dewayne Wade's openness as a meaningful example, especially given how guarded the sports world has historically been about conversations like this one. But it hasn't all been warm, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest either. Gabrielle Union has spoken candidly about the other side of that attention, saying that along with the support came real hostility, comments online ranging from dismissive to outright hateful. The family has said that backlash shaped practical decisions in their lives, including their choice to move away from Florida, in part because of legislation in the state targeting LGBTQ+ people. Zaya herself has said in interviews that she still regularly deals with people who treat her identity as something open for debate, rather than a simple fact about who she is. People who assume she's too young to know herself, or that this is something she'll eventually grow out of. There's also a specific strain of criticism aimed less at Zaya and more at her father. Questions about whether a parent should be this public about a child's gender journey at all, and whether some of the attention has crossed into using it for visibility or business opportunities. That's essentially the same argument CO Von Funches raised in her court filing, and has followed the family through interview after interview over the years. Wade's answer consistently has been that Zaya is the one driving these moments herself. That she's the one who's asked him to speak publicly, asked him to file the legal paperwork, asked him to use his platform, and that staying silent stopped being an option once she decided she wanted to live openly as herself. There's also a layer to this that doesn't come up as often, which is the specific position Zaya occupies as a black trans woman living in the public eye. She's spoken about her father's upbringing in a traditional black household in Chicago, describing that environment in his own framing as one that historically wasn't very accepting of queerness, which is part of what makes this shift feel significant to her personally. At the same time, being black and trans places her at the intersection of more than one kind of scrutiny, and she said in interviews that her own safety is something she actively thinks about, not as an abstract talking point, but as part of her actual day-to-day reality. What's probably fair to say is that Zaya's coming out experience looked very different from most trans teenagers simply because of the scale of attention attached to it. Most kids navigating this don't have a Hall of Fame athlete as a built-in advocate, but most kids also aren't processing their identity while strangers online debate it in real time. Both of those things are true at once, and they're a big part of why her story has stuck around in the public conversation for as long as it has. This is the part of Zaya's story that probably gets the least attention, even though it might end up being the most lasting thing she's built. In May 2024, Zaya and her father launched a project called Translatable through the Wade Family Foundation. On the surface, it's described as a digital safe space for LGBTQIA+ youth, but once you actually look into what it does, it's a lot more built out than that description suggests. The platform was designed to give young queer and trans people, especially youth of color, a place to express themselves through things like poetry, photography, and arts and missions, alongside a growing library of educational resources aimed at families trying to figure out how to support a kid going through something similar to what Zaya went through. In the launch materials, Zaya talked about wanting the platform to center the people who get the least attention in the broader LGBTQ+ conversation, not just the most visible faces with platforms already built in. Kids who don't have a famous parent, a publicist, or an existing audience behind them. The personal motivation behind it is worth knowing too. Zaya has talked about managing ADHD and a spatial visual processing difference, and how navigating those things alongside her gender identity made her realize how much it mattered to have what she's called a village, a network of people who understood what she was going through and could actually help her through it. Not everyone has that. A lot of queer and trans kids are working through similar journeys with no support system at all, without a Gabrielle Union or a Dewayne Wade in the next room, and without the resources that came with that kind of family situation. Translatable was built specifically to try to close that gap for kids who don't have what she had. The project has continued to grow rather than sitting still. It's become an annual fundraising event called the Translatable Ball, which just held its second edition this past May. That event has turned into a kind of yearly check-in point for the project and for Zaya personally. It's actually where she gave a lot of her most recent comments about adjusting to college life, which we'll get into shortly. At that same event, Dewayne Wade talked about Zaya in a way that goes beyond standard proud parent talking points. He spoke about being genuinely inspired by the courage she's shown, saying that watching her settle into a real sense of safety and confidence within herself gives him hope. And at one point he simply called himself a fan of his own daughter. There's a harder backdrop here too. Translatable exists and continues expanding during a stretch where legislation affecting transgender people, especially trans youth, has gotten more aggressive across parts of the country. Zaya has talked about the current political climate around trans rights as something that's personally affected her, describing certain policy shifts as something that set her back emotionally. That context reframes the project as more than a passion project loosely attached to a modeling career. It functions as a direct, practical response to a moment where a lot of young trans people are dealing with real pressure layered on top of the usual difficulty of growing up. So when people talk about Zaya's advocacy like it's just a label attached to her public image, it's worth pointing out there's an actual organization behind it now, with an actual annual event, real submitted work from real kids, and resources families can genuinely use. It's become something close to a second full-time focus in her life, running right alongside school and modeling, not a side project she occasionally mentions in interviews. Outside of the advocacy work, Zaya has quietly built a serious career in academic life that would be a lot for anyone to balance, let alone someone dealing with this level of public attention on top of it. On the modeling side, she's walked in major fashion shows, including a much discussed appearance on the Miu Miu runway in Paris, and landed campaigns with brands like Tiffany & Co. and Dove. She's talked about wanting to approach modeling authentically, refusing to hide her transition or soften who she is to fit a more conventional mold, while also being intentional about representing Black beauty standards instead of leaning into a default that leaves them out. Academically, she's headed somewhere that probably surprises people who only know her from red carpet photos. She's studying in a field connected to astrobiology, essentially the science of researching whether life could exist elsewhere in the universe, which is about as far from celebrity influencer career track as it gets. Gabrielle Union has joked in interviews that Zaya's academic interests have genuinely outpaced what she and Dewayne can keep up with, describing moments where Zaya casually brings up research topics that send her parents quietly searching the term under the table just to follow along. It's a funny but it also says something real about who Zaya is underneath the public persona. Someone clearly more invested in research and ideas than most people probably assume from the outside looking in. She's also been open about more personal parts of growing up, including gender-affirming care. She's discussed going through hormone therapy as part of her transition and described it as something that's made her feel more comfortable in her own skin than she's ever felt, which tracks with how she's generally talked about this whole journey, not as a burden she's pushing through, but as a process that's let her finally settle into who she already knew she was. Between modeling shoots, a demanding course load, and translatable, it's a packed life for anyone, let alone someone also adjusting to a college campus for the first time without her usual support system close by. Which brings us to the part of the story that connects everything back to where we started. This past year marked Zaya's first real stretch of life away from Dewayne Wade and Gabrielle Union, and she's been refreshingly honest about what that's actually felt like. Speaking at that second annual translatable ball in May, she described being away from her parents in pretty simple terms. She called it hard, not in a dramatic, falling apart kind of way, but in an ordinary sense that anyone who's left home for the first time would recognize immediately. At the same time, she said the distance has been freeing in its own way, pushing her to come out of her shell socially in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if she was still living at home, surrounded by the same familiar support system. She's talked specifically about how the experience has changed the way she interacts with people. According to her, she's become a lot more comfortable approaching strangers and starting conversations, something she's directly credited to the independence that comes with college life. She's framed the whole adjustment around the idea of connection, meeting new people, building relationships without her family's circle as a built-in safety net, and figuring out who she is in rooms where she isn't automatically introduced as Dewayne Wade's daughter the moment she walks in. Even the smaller details paint a picture of a fairly normal, if slightly bittersweet, transition into college life despite the famous last name attached to it. She's joked about her dad's parting advice before she left for school, which basically amounted to a half-serious warning not to waste the opportunity, paired with a pointed reminder of exactly how much the tuition was costing him. It's a small moment, but it's a good reminder that underneath the modeling campaigns, the advocacy work, and the legal battle that played out in public, this is still a family with the same kind of dynamic you find anywhere. A dad cracking jokes about tuition bills, a daughter laughing about it later in an interview while admitting, in the same breath, that she genuinely misses home. Gabrielle Union has echoed that picture from the parent side, describing Zaya as thriving as she wraps up her first year, particularly when it comes to her academic interests. She's also used the platform to offer advice for other parents navigating something similar with their own kids, saying that leading with love matters more than getting every single thing right immediately. And that being willing to be corrected and to keep learning is part of doing right by a child going through this kind of journey, even from a distance. So that's where things actually stand right now underneath the headline. At 19, Zaya Wade is balancing a modeling career, a science-heavy course load most people would find intimidating, an advocacy organization that's grown into a real annual event with measurable impact, and the quiet, ordinary difficulty of figuring out who she is outside her parents' house for the first time, while also carrying the weight of a public legal fight and years of online scrutiny most teenagers never have to think about. That's a genuinely full plate for anyone. It's worth remembering that underneath the red carpet photos and the headlines, it adds up to a pretty human story about a kid figuring out adulthood while missing her parents like anyone else would. It just happens to be playing out with a few more cameras pointed at her than most of us will ever deal with. Looking at the full arc of this story, from an 8-year-old quietly telling her family she was gay, to a